Hello, Vladimir. So, tell us please what happened in the week past. What was going on with Russian economy, with inflation, with gasoline, with Nabiullina, and anything else that you paid attention to and you think that's important. Hello, yes, a lot of things happened. Let's start with breaking news that at the end of the week, Great Britain and the United States announced that they implemented prohibition and sanctions against Russian precious metal, aluminum, copper, nickel, etc. I would say this was one of the biggest export articles of Russian Federation that was still absolutely not sanctioned. It brings over $20 billion per year in currency to Russia. About half of it is aluminum, a quarter of that is copper, the rest is smaller percentage. And the main key question here is that the key importer of these metals is European Union. And they've been talking for a while about implementing sanctions against precious metals from Russia. Very often, Poland and Baltic countries are introducing these measures to every sanctions package, yet Europe at large still has not made its decision to implement them. So the fact that it is America and Britain implementing them would probably not change things much. Perhaps they will be precursors and will help Europe to finally make its mind about them. If Europe will make its mind about limiting the import of these metals, that'll hit Russia rather hard. I've also just seen another piece of news that, according to so-called elections that passed in Russia, there'll be another inauguration of Putin, and there'll be some rearrangements in the government. And Andrei Belousov might move to the State Audit Office. Why is it so important if it is indeed happening? Belousov is the main economist of Putin, who was working with him closely since 2000s. And he is the main ideologist. He is one of the most well-known and biggest macroeconomists in the country. He is the creator of that MACPA Center of Macroeconomic Analysis and Short-Term Prognostication. All the prime ministers were using their research since the end of the 90s, and he's the leader and the main driver of that whole ideology of national projects, replacement of imports with Russian manufactured goods. So if he's being removed, this de facto is acknowledgement that all that program is not quite breathing well, and they're rather failing to do that. So it will be interesting to observe changes in the new chamber, in the new committee that will be assembled in his place, and it'll be interesting to see who will take his space. But he is one of the pillars. He's the guy who was the ideologist and the main locomotive of all that import replacements. So if he's being removed, that basically is an acknowledgement that things are not faring too well for them. As for economic news, let's start with gasoline, because on the last week, Russian Stat published a usual weekly report, and production fell again to the lowest level over the last several months. It's 17% lower than production was at the end of February. So it is obvious that they're failing to repair the refineries that were damaged by Ukrainian UAVs, and the effect is rather extended on their economy. Diesel fell only by 9%, so it tells us that these hits were disproportionately affecting the facilities for high-octane fuels refinery. So gasoline got hit much worse than diesel, than lower-grade products. But as you see, these strikes have somewhat concluded. During the last, couple weeks, we saw maybe one hit on Nizhnekamsky oil refinery, and it is not exactly clear whether Russians learned to intercept these UAVs or if Ukrainians are actually starting to listen to the United States and slowing down their attacks on the refineries. But one can tell that even with the strikes that they carried out in March, they caused a serious damage to the gasoline market in Russia. And Putin's Russia is still failing to regulate that back. Remember, we also talked that retail prices were still not moving, and they started last week. by several dozen cents, and you can see that 95 and 98 octane fuels have increased rather notably. So they were holding them in relation to Putin's so-called elections, but finally they are starting to move a couple of weeks after. So we will continue monitoring this and we'll see how much that will affect. But I have to concur that they have kind of stopped. Do not forget to click like, subscribe, and share our videos. That helps us to promote, that helps more eyeballs to get to that. Follow this link and support us if you can. And now let's get back to conversation with Vladimir. So the next important element of this week is Ministry of Finance published report about their budget last month. And on one hand, there are things they're doing a little better, and they decreased the deficit. Remember we talked about the February deficit that reached almost the planned annual. They indeed diminished the deficit. Now, as a result of 3 months, it's not 1.5 trillions, but only 607 billion rubles. This is lower than the previous figure, but a very important moment here, I of course started digging in and checking how did they catch up. They acknowledge that there was one-time significant transaction into the budget from oil and gas income. So they have milked some of those industries, some of the companies there. They are not clarifying what exactly did they do, but they're saying that it is a one-time non-tax related payment. I don't know exactly what it is, but so I will continue looking for an answer. But as for oil and gas, they're also saying that they got additional payments for the fourth quarter of last year. So they have not increased their income base. They've caught up on some payments that apparently they had outstanding that needed to be collected. And there is a first proof that their policies are actually biting. We saw that Sechin, the head of Rosneft company, had awoken. We haven't seen him in any public sphere. He wrote a letter to Putin, an open letter, that his government needs to change the method of calculating export prices for the Urals brand. So translating that into understandable language, these methods that Minister of Finance practiced this month was really biting. So the head of one of the biggest companies coming out and suggesting to change that. So this approach from Minister of Finance to find ways to gather more money into the budget results in oil companies running short of funds to pay for their bills and to continue functioning. I think Putin resent this letter to government and there likely will not be any reaction, but the oil companies really do not have much choice here. If the government will continue extracting too much taxes from them, they'll have to diminish their capital investments, and how this topic works in perpetuity was very well described in Yegor Gaidar's book, Death of an Empire. That's exactly what was happening at the end of Soviet Union in 1980s. Oil companies were not given money. Nothing was left for them to reinvest and to upgrade their equipment. So eventually that led to their diminished production due to damaged hardware. The only thing that can save them is some global growth for oil prices. And here we have two competing trends. On one hand, Brent was holding above $90 per barrel, and there are super high geopolitical risks present on the market. Everybody is discussing possible conflict between Iran and Israel. United States warned that Iran may continue hitting Israel, and in return and retaliation to Israel hit in Damascus. So if there will be indeed a prolonged military action between these two, oil will likely grow in price. We'll see what happens. Even if it will not lead to any significant consequences on the oil market, for traders, this is a golden opportunity to bring the price up and use this volatility to maybe 150 per barrel. On the other hand, we got March data from China. That March data is horrible, much worse than it was expected. Their export lowered, the import diminished as well, and restart of their economy that everybody is waiting for is not happening. So this is a serious factor affecting the global market. There were pretty good numbers coming out of China during the last 5 or 6 weeks, and this is one of the factors that allowed Brent to grow up to $90 per barrel. But slowing down China with these deep issues, it will start pulling the numbers down, I think. So these two vectors are going in opposite directions. Of course, it would be more beneficial to Putin if Iran would succeed in hitting something in Israel. Even these non-cosmic prices for oil, Urals, is still lower than $70 per barrel, but it does help Russia and Putin's regime to support their plans. So any kind of geopolitical strain is important for them. Summing it up, March is a relatively good month for them in terms of budget, but the problem is that this is a one-time pull, one-time excavation of some income that will not be reflected in economy in the long term. So we'll continue following this development of that situation in April. Next moment is inflation. On the 9th of March, Nabiullina was out with a big and detailed report in Russian Duma and Russian Congress. I was there listening to that for the whole 4 hours. Oh, poor man. Indeed, I should be given some milk or something for that difficult work. But let's talk in more details. The fact was that congressman actually decided to chime in and to give her some frying over her report. So on one hand, I was listening to her at the beginning. She was boasting how successful they are, how deflationary processes are successful and reaching the set goals. And then I go to the site of Rosstat and I see that inflation is growing. It grew 0.2 over week and reached 7.79 in annual expression. So where are those deflationary processes that she's talking about? I'm failing to see them. And that's what Congressman highlighted for her. And again, our usual hit parade of the products with different prices. We get a change of leader. Now it's beets over 32%, cabbage is at 32%, and cucumbers have returned down to the beginning of this year. So they played back that 30% that they gained. But the other groups are still on the rise. They're still following veggies, and the price growth follows in all the different consumer goods. And I even made a separate table for medications, because straight behind the food products, medications are growing too, in all the different groups. You can see that Corvalol is at 8%, vitamins is over 5%, and the most uncomfortable thing for Russia is that these prices will continue growing, because discussions about these products on the market just indicate that they're heavily dependent on import components, and some numbers reach even 90% on some of the medications, that they're 90% dependent on the foreign manufacturing. So, of course, it will translate in the future growth of prices on medications in Russia. This is one of the most vulnerable groups of consumer goods straight after the food items. What else was interesting? There were several interesting interviews published last week. I usually suggest our viewers to check, and I post some of the links at the description. There is a fellow named Oleg Vyugin. You actually took an interview from him when the war just started. I am not quite in agreement with a lot of things that he is saying, but he is still one of the most well-educated and knowledgeable people in Russian economy. So he deserves an ear, he deserves listening to. He was VP of Finance, he was the head of Federal Service on stock exchanges. He had a pretty remarkable career. So he gave an interview to Russian Forbes Talk, and he's saying very interesting things there, that real inflation is much higher than official numbers, that central bank, and I think he's the first one from the big figures, big economists in Russia, who is saying it out loud, that for 9 months central bank is trying to hold it with high percent rate, and they're failing. Because one thing is me and you discussing it here, people are throwing tomatoes at me for prognostications and all, but here's Vyugin coming out and confirming what we were discussing here. He is one of the major figures in Russian economy. Right, he is in Russia, he is there, he is answering questions when he's asked if he's talking to Nabiullina and the rest. Yeah, he says he is. So he's saying that central bank is failing to cope with inflation. And the second important moment is that he's saying, of course, it is not 7.5%. And the thought is very important to get it, that if central bank is holding its interest at 16% and failing to cope with inflation, that means the inflation is higher than 16%. And just like you have to read those Z channels, pro-Putin stuff on Telegram, I have to watch and monitor the economic channels. Garagin Tesunyan, he is the president of Association of Russian Banks. He was giving an interview on the first channel, and without coordinating with Vyugin, he's basically stated the same, that real inflation is much higher than 7.5%. And another interview that I would suggest to view is on RBC Investment channel. There was an interview with Sergei Dubinin, ex-chair of the Central Bank. Also, I cannot agree with some points that he's making, but he is also talking about inflation and about the fact that ruble exchange rate is so non-market right now that it is being artificially held with these stories of mandatory sale of income in foreign currency, so it's not reflective of the real exchange rate. Let's watch a couple of minutes of different clips that I've collected. I can sense that central bank will have difficult time trying to stop inflation, unlike many other previous situations when they were successful. And 16% interest rate that we have today, as many analytics notice, it does not change the level of activity of consumers, first of all. And you can see that people are spending more and saving quite a bit. So it basically tells us that the interest rate is so high, but it's still below the inflation. So what is the level of inflation, do you think, going to be in the next year? First of all, I want to say that the level of inflation we had last year, it was not 7.5%. It was higher? Of course it was higher. How much higher? I think it's, and that's my observation, if 16% interest rate is not slowing down inflationary process, that means inflation is higher. So it is higher than 16%. And yeah, now official inflation is not 7%, it's at least 14. Official is 7. Well, you know, there is inflation of consumer goods market, which is obviously higher than this number, and even higher than the interest rate in the bank. So what do you think about the current ruble exchange rate? There are different opinions being voiced in the country that our current exchange rate of Russian ruble is very artificial and very manually managed right now, with a lot of limitations and due to demands of obligatory sale and getting conversion of the currency income for Russian companies. Yeah, it is not a market rate, absolutely. This mechanism works with a severe manual management. So this is administrative market, administrative exchange rate. So here's a bunch of different people, different specialists. You can watch all these 3 interviews. These are well-established Russian economists who still are there in the country. They're the top-level economists in today's Russia, but they're basically confirming what me and Michael are talking about here. It was very interesting to observe 4 hours of Nabiullina in Congress as well. One half of it is when she was boasting her achievements, but then congressman took microphone and explained her what the real situation is. I don't want to torture you with extended clips. I made some for about 4 minutes, I think. I'll post that in my channel because I have a lot of materials from these hearings and different bureaucrats, how they explain things in the economy. But here's a short version of that clip. And you can hear that they are very dissatisfied with her explanation. They're explaining her that economy is failing to react to their methods of trying to control inflation. And everything, all the income, all the growth that they see is only due to a military aspect. That business does not even have nearly as much of profitability to stay afloat under 16% interest rate. And these are the same congressmen, Kolomeitsev, Gart, and Dmitrieva, who usually bring up a lot of questions, but they were not shy. They actually attacked her straight on. It looks interesting. You know, I remembered our author, Krylov, Ivan Andreevich, when the Prime Minister was giving a speech. Everybody was applauding. The central bank had getting his applause, but the country suffers. Just give it a thought. We have 50 million citizens who have 34.8 trillion rubles of credit, which grew by 6.4 trillions over last year, out of which 4.5 trillions come from those who have mortgage. Do you think our life is getting better or worse, looking at these numbers? Second moment, President inspired us all, saying that we are the fifth country by the parity of consumption ability. But look at monetization. We're country number 13, and we are 41 times behind China, 21 times lesser than United States, and I can continue. So his statements are quite different from what we see in the world. And I think if we're gathering here to solve matters, we need to discuss them in a more objective light. Because growth of 3.6% of our industry, if you listen to our Prime Minister attentively, the quantitative increase of military-industrial complex is 8 trillions. This is exactly 3.6% growth. Bank and other income have nothing to do with it. Dear Elvira, you're explaining high rate of interest as it is necessary for slowing down inflation, and it doesn't affect business. The opposite is true. It has very weak reflection on the inflation growth, but it suppresses the growth of investments. Then you also said that if the companies have their income on the rise, they can tolerate high interest rates from the same incomes. But the credit is only 10 to 15% from the amount of investments, lesser than budgetary means. If you think this is an acceptable rate, then why do we need banks and such a regulator when system cannot solve the main task of the bank activity, to provide capital as the source for development? Bank of Russia did everything to kill economic growth, yet it failed to. 3.6% we still have here. Now let's try to look deeper into everything else. So there is a little bit of positive. But let's continue. Economic growth occurred not because of politics of central bank or their aid, but despite it, because at 16% of bank interest rate, and the best rate for the companies would be 18 to 20%. What investments can you talk about at this interest rate? You need investments in the industries with the maximum value added numbers. And let's look at the profitability. Because of the high value of credits, we cannot invest, right? You cannot pay it back. Elvira Nabiullina notices that the companies should be able to use their profit, right? Let's look at the truck manufacturer, KAMAZ, the leader of our vehicle production. I think in the history, I don't remember years when they had so much to produce. They're below 5% in their profitability. So imagine that same KAMAZ, or let's take any other company, any heavy industry company. Imagine they need to add additional 50 billion rubles worth of produce per year. They need investments similar to that number, right? To build new facilities. KAMAZ has only 18 billion of pure profits. Where would they take this 50 billion from? You're saying next source of investments is a fund market. But after the court decision on Solikam's factory about minority shares, what investments can you talk about? Who will be buying these shares on the organized trade? So, see, guys, and I once again will continue finding these snippets by different economists and official bureaucrats who show that the picture of the world is not exactly what Putin and Nabiullina are drawing it to be. By the way, Kolomitsev also went very well over that fifth economy of the world. And they're doing that from the Congress pulpit. They're just making it laughable. That idiocy about fifth economy of the world, even in the official offices of Putin, it's rather well understood that real situation is different. And once again, I'll repeat that there was a lot of things discussed. They were talking about the explosive problem with deficit in personnel, that population is overcredited and we need to limit that somehow because people are still acquiring more credits and they will not be able to be paying them out soon. So they talked about a lot of things. I'll make another video about it and I'll post on my channel. What else during this past week? Another important moment, let's go back to sanctions. There were a lot of conversations that these sanctions don't work, but here's a piece of news that Novatek basically stopped its work on the Arctic liquefied natural gas 2 project. This is one of the biggest projects on Yamal-Nenetsk Autonomous District, and it was expected to grow to its full production capability. If we take today's price of liquefied gas, it would have brought Russia about $10 billion of profit from it, just that project. But Americans added it in November to a special list of prohibited projects that does not allow Americans to deal with that business project in any capacity. And South Koreans who were supposed to build tankers on their docks, they also refused to do that. They're concerned with consequences from the United States. So this project is now left without those liquefied carriers suitable for northern seas for breaking the ice. So they cannot pump that gas. They have nothing, they have no means to export it with. And Novatek is discussing now how to change it and perhaps build another factory in Murmansk where there is no ice and perhaps one can carry that liquefied gas in direction of Europe. So that was a very strong hit on that element of Russian economy, that it was included into sanctions. So we cannot say that sanctions don't work. That would be a very big exaggeration. And another element that we have not talked about for a while, but we should, this is the mortgage market. You can read some of the headlines of RBC real estate. According to estimates by experts, the demand for secondary housing market dropped by 30%. And we can see that purchases are slowing down on both the primary and the secondary markets. But the only thing that it has not reflected into the price yet, and the realtor is still holding the prices at the previous levels, but it will get there. They all need cash, they all need to start paying back to the banks, they're all on their credit lines. They're still trying to get something out of this market, but the market is stagnating since the beginning of this year. The moment they canceled those special social mortgage programs, that will get reflected in the prices for real estate, of course. And many experts, and even in the official circles, they're prognosticating the price drop by 10 to 15% for real estate. For now, it's a pause on the market. Developers are holding to the last moment, but they will have to. There is no other vector. New demand for all that not sold, newly built construction. We already talked about that. They have about 67% of newly built construction not being sold in Russia. So such a construct on the market cannot exist for too long. So those people who are laughing at our previous prognosis about the promised price drop for real estate, it will be there. As you can see, all vectors are pushing it in that direction. You can go to RBC Real Estate and monitor all these changes. What else? We can also talk about ruble. You can see that it was getting weaker. It was approaching 94 per dollar. despite that there were a lot of prognosis in March by the analysts that the ruble will get stronger, that it'll get to 80 rubles. Tell us more, Vladimir, how do they hold it? You did mention that it is very non-market currency right now. So tell us more, how did you lose your $100, I would say, even with interest, because you gave it to me in euro. So how are they holding ruble? And how effective and reliable it is for them? Right. There was a lot of work, so I didn't have time to convert euros into dollars, so I just gave 100 euros to Mike on the bet that we did. But briefly speaking, and I think it could be, by the way, your bonus for a serious variation from my prognosis where I said it'll be 200, but I'm quite sure it'll get there. We'll get to this argument later this year. The main story is that the new rule for obligatory conversion of hard currency into rubles, an interesting situation develops. Exporters start to get a lot of currency stuck in the bank's account overseas. And we're discussing in our economic chat with colleagues, there is a feeling that, remember that news recently about Chinese banks and Turkish banks refusing to trade with Russia? We have a feeling that way many from these items are not real problems with Chinese or Turkish banks, but it is rather very often used as an excuse to not return currency back to Russia by the companies. This is very much reminiscent of the mechanisms of the 90s and early 2000s when this demand was still in force. Later they just stopped enforcing it and companies refused to follow up. Companies were holding it there, finding different reasons, and right now there are a lot of excuses that do not pass the smell test. And as we discussed, that if this demand for obligatory conversion of currency would be extended, exporters will find different cunning ways to not return currency back to Russia. And this is an interesting paradox unfolding. Central Bank is saying that exporters have sold a record amount in March, but the biggest amount, the biggest part of it, is not still back in Russia. And that's why there is a deficit of currency and ruble is falling. So I have a feeling that exporters are also pushing the government and showing it that, if you will continue pressing us with these measures, we will find other ways to not return currency to Russia. So let's find some compromise. So listen, lad, I don't think they will, right? They don't have other ways to hold the exchange rate of ruble. Right, there are no other mechanisms, but there is also no way to preclude exporters from not returning currency to Russia. Well, you can maybe put them in jail or execute them. Right, well, there are still those chicken that bring them golden eggs. They can maybe punish somebody, one or two people, but that same Nabiullina and many other functionaries have acknowledged that for exporters, this is a very uncomfortable measure, that they still have to first sell it into rubles, then they have to purchase it back for their new transactions. And this is a very expensive and a bad scheme. So, yes, they can put somebody in jail, but they also understand that, and their open discussion in this regard reveals that this is not a long-term measure. It might stabilize things for a short term, but it is very useless long-term, because people find a lot of different ways, 400 relatively honest ways of not returning currency back to Russia. That's why my prognosis remains that this measure, and this was the only one that actually is holding ruble, it'll start working the more time passes, and ruble will start falling further and further. And that's what we start seeing in the next couple of weeks, despite the prognosis that it'll perhaps get stronger, get to 80 rubles per dollar. It now is drifting towards 100. It's getting weaker. So there is no better measure they have, and this one is losing its effectivity. So it will continue to become cheaper, and it will become another factor that will exacerbate inflation, because dependency upon imports is not disappearing, and that returns us back into that vicious circle that high interest rate of central bank is not working. and it is getting more and more difficult for them to hold that situation. The only thing that can save them now is some big war between Israel and Iran, perhaps. Putin would be beside himself. Nothing will fall on his head, and the oil will probably climb to $150 a barrel or something. So we'll see how it unfolds, and we'll see what happens. All right, let's hope that this doesn't happen. At least I do. I think we got enough wars for our century. Right, but the warnings are pretty serious. And with that same Crocus terrorist act, right, that happened in Russia, when the US comes out warning about things, it usually means that there is something behind it. So, right, there is a conversation that perhaps there will be shooting, one side will shoot, the other will shoot, of course, but I don't see the probability for a long-term war. I'm looking at the map. How can Iran get to Israel? There's no direct connection. I would agree with you on this, right? If anything, it would or could last for a rather short term, maybe a month. But if it happens, Putin will get a lot of profits for that month. Let's hope this doesn't happen, though. However, I see that there is such a consolidation against Israel in the Muslim world that for Iran, it is definitely tempting to push this agenda and to be those heroes, in quotes, that hit back Israel. So these warnings and this situation is concerning. Right, let's wait for the better, but let's prepare for the worst as usual. And we'll see you again soon. Till later.